The Prince of Darkness is gone, and fans around the world are in shock. But behind the tributes and headlines, something quieter is happening. Ozzy's family is beginning to uncover what he left behind, and it's not just a fortune. It's pieces of a man who spent his final years trying to make peace with the chaos he'd once become. Tucked between old guitars and lyric sheets are memories, regrets, and messages he never spoke out loud. And now, for the first time, they're realizing just how much of himself he kept hidden, until the very end. And it's what they found in those final pages that brought them to tears. By the time Ozzy Osbourne stepped back from the spotlight, fans had already started to worry. He wasn't touring, he wasn't filming, and when he did appear, his voice was softer, his movements slower. The chaos that had once defined him was gone. For decades, Ozzy was the face of mayhem. The bat incident, the arrests, the slurred words and strange outbursts. He'd been mocked, feared, worshipped, but underneath it all, there had always been a different man trying to get through. And as his body began to fail him, after years of surgeries, spinal issues, tremors, and pain, that quieter side finally took over. In 2020, Ozzy confirmed what many had feared. He had Parkinson's disease. He called it a nightmare, and admitted it had been getting worse for a while. His family knew, of course. Sharon had been helping him walk through the house. Jack and Kelly had seen the changes. But Ozzy had kept it from the public as long as he could. When he did speak about it, it wasn't for sympathy. He just wanted people to know why he'd gone silent. What fans didn't know, what even some of his family didn't know, is that during those final years, Ozzy wasn't just resting. He was preparing. He started spending long hours in his home studio, not recording albums, just listening. He revisited old tapes. He pulled out lyric notebooks from the 1980s. He'd sit for hours flipping through pages of forgotten verses, scribbled thoughts, half-finished songs. Sometimes he'd laugh. Sometimes he'd cry. And more than once, he'd stop what he was doing and just stare at the wall. Sharon once told a close friend that Ozzy was going somewhere in his head, somewhere he hadn't been in years. He wasn't just reminiscing. He was making peace with himself, with the damage he'd done, with the things he never got to say. That peace didn't come easily. Ozzy had lived most of his life in extremes. Fame, addiction, adoration, self-destruction. He'd lost friends, burned bridges, missed birthdays, forgotten names. And though he often laughed it off in public, those memories never stopped following him. During this time, he became deeply protective of certain items. He'd lock away boxes of tapes and notebooks. He asked his staff not to touch certain drawers in the studio. And when asked what he was working on, he'd just smile and say, "Nothing, just sorting my mess." But it wasn't a mess. Not to him. It was a map, a trail of breadcrumbs leading back through the chaos, toward something gentler, something he wanted his family to find after he was gone. And so he kept going, even when walking became painful, even when the tremors made it hard to hold a pen, even when his voice began to falter, because this time he wasn't performing for millions. He was writing for 5 people: Sharon, Jack, Kelly, Amy, and himself. And when the time finally came, when Ozzy could no longer return to that studio, he left everything just as it was. Not labeled, not explained, just waiting. And when his family stepped into that space for the first time after his passing, they understood. He hadn't left them instructions. He'd left them a doorway into his heart. There was no grand announcement, no sealed envelope marked, "Read after I'm gone." Ozzy Osbourne didn't do sentiment the way most people do. But his family knew, within minutes of stepping into that room, that he'd been preparing them for this moment all along. It started with the notebooks, scattered across the desk, across old amps and coffee tables, some half-filled, some nearly falling apart. But every one of them in Ozzy's unmistakable handwriting. Sharp, messy, frantic. Pages of lyrics no one had ever seen. Some dated, some not. Snippets of memories, scribbled names. Randy, Sharon, Jack, Tony, Mom. Little pieces of a life lived loud, and now preserved in ink. Sharon picked one up and froze. It was a verse from a song no one had heard, written to her. It wasn't romantic. It was raw. An apology. Thank you. A confession. She sat down on the couch and didn't say a word for a long time. Jack found something else. A reel-to-reel tape marked 1979, Don't Erase. It was a demo, just Ozzy and a piano. No effects. No band. The voice on the tape was younger, but uncertain. You could hear him stop mid-sentence. You could hear him try again. And at the end, just a whisper. Maybe I'll finish it someday. Kelly discovered a USB drive tucked into an old tour jacket. Inside, hundreds of voice memos. Ozzy talking to himself. Rambling thoughts. Song ideas. Unsent messages. One of them began with, "If you're listening to this, I guess I'm not around anymore." They listened to it together, sitting on the floor, knees pulled to their chests. No one spoke, because how could they? He hadn't left them instructions. He'd left them pieces. Fragments of himself he didn't have the strength or maybe the courage to say out loud. There were pictures, too. Dozens of them. Some from the early Sabbath days, others from private family holidays. Most had never been seen before. One photo, folded up in the back of a lyric book, showed Ozzy and Randy Rhoads, arms over each other's shoulders, backstage and laughing. On the back, in fading ink, Ozzy had written, "Still miss you every day." And then, they opened the chest. An actual wooden chest he kept in his studio closet. Inside was a small stack of letters, each one addressed by hand, each sealed. One for Sharon, one for each of the kids. None of them were ready to open theirs just yet, but they held them, pressed them to their chests, and cried, because the man they knew, the wild, chaotic, unpredictable Ozzy, had left them something they never expected. Closure. And not the kind that comes with wealth or royalties or awards. The kind that only comes when someone you love looks back on their life and finally tells you the truth. Ozzy Osbourne was never known for subtlety. He lived loud. He fought, he broke things, he scared people. And for most of his life, he never looked back. But something changed in those final years. He stopped talking about tours. He stopped fighting the label. He stopped trying to prove anything. Because deep down, Ozzy knew there were things he hadn't said, and people he hadn't said them to. He'd spent decades apologizing without saying the word. To Sharon, to the kids, to the fans, to himself. But as the Parkinson's worsened, as his body betrayed him, he realized the time to make things right was slipping away. He began reaching out quietly and sometimes awkwardly. He sent a message to Tony Iommi. Not a grand gesture, just a short note, thanking him for the music, for the beginning. No mention of the fights, the firings, the bitterness. Just, we made something, and I never stopped being proud of that. He asked about Bill Ward. He hadn't spoken to him in years, not properly, but he asked Jack to check in. And when the band reunited for that final show in Birmingham, Ozzy didn't care about the set list. He just wanted them all in the same room again. He also talked more about Randy, sometimes out loud, sometimes only in writing. But those who were close to him say that losing Randy Rhoads was a wound he never truly recovered from. He kept a photo of him in his guitar room, and before that last performance, he sat alone with it for nearly 20 minutes. But the hardest piece, the one Ozzy wrestled with most, was fatherhood. Because for all his fame, for all his success, he knew he hadn't always been the father his children needed. Kelly once joked in an interview that Ozzy used to forget her birthday, but remembered the name of every roadie he'd ever hired. She laughed when she said it, but he never did. Amy, his eldest daughter, chose to step away from the spotlight altogether. She refused to be part of the Osbournes' reality show, and for years they barely spoke. Ozzy never said much about it publicly, but in one of his final audio notes he said, "I wasn't always there, and I know what that cost me." That was Ozzy's quiet truth. He wasn't trying to be forgiven. He just wanted them to know he saw it, that he understood now. He even tried to write a song about it, just a few chords on an acoustic guitar, never recorded. Jack found the lyrics folded inside an old notebook. I didn't say it when I should've, didn't know how when I could've, but I was listening, I was learning, and I loved you the whole time. There was no chorus, no title, just that single verse, and a faint scrawl at the bottom. Don't throw this out, because Ozzy wasn't just closing a chapter. He was cleaning the slate, making peace with the boy who started it all, and the man he became, not for the crowd, not for the fans, for the family that saw him at his worst, and still showed up anyway. Ozzy Osbourne's fortune is massive. Hundreds of millions in royalties, music catalogs, publishing rights, the Ozfest brand, real estate across 2 continents. But that's not what made his family cry, because buried inside all that wealth were things that couldn't be measured. In his London home, inside a locked drawer in the study, Sharon found a box wrapped in black cloth. Inside, a tattered backstage pass from 1980, his first solo tour, a cassette marked Mum's Favorite in shaky handwriting, and a tiny gold chain with a small crucifix, worn down to almost nothing. No note, no explanation, just memories, left quietly, deliberately. In a weathered leather bag, Jack found tour itineraries covered in drawings Ozzy had made when he was bored on the road. Little cartoon versions of himself. Notes like, Miss Kelly's piano recital, call Sharon, try again. The kind of things that showed the man behind the myth, trying, failing, remembering. Kelly uncovered a folder full of unreleased lyrics. Some angry, some heartbreakingly soft. One labeled for the girl who stayed. Lyrics full of fatherly longing and guilt. She couldn't finish reading it the first time, and neither could Sharon. Then came the photo albums. Not the ones from TV or tour photographers. These were hand-assembled one by one over the years. Pictures of the kids asleep in the tour bus. Sharon holding Ozzy's hand backstage. Old Polaroids of Sabbath rehearsals with handwritten captions like, "Didn't know it then, but this was the best it ever got." There were financial documents too. Ozzy had made sure things were in order. Every asset accounted for, every decision clearly made. But what moved the family most wasn't how much he had. It was how much he saved. The letters, the scribbled notes, the song fragments and photo captions that told the real story. Not of Ozzy Osbourne the icon, but of Ozzy the husband, Ozzy the father, Ozzy the friend who never quite knew how to say what he meant, but never stopped trying. Even Amy, who had stayed distant for years, was stunned by what she found in her envelope. It's not known exactly what Ozzy wrote to her, but sources close to the family say she held onto it longer than anyone. And when she finally walked out of the studio that day, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying from grief. She was crying from understanding, because everything he left behind, the chaos, the calm, the pain, the effort was finally visible. And the silence he carried for so long had finally broken. It wasn't wealth that made them weep. It was seeing how much he'd held on to, how much he remembered, how deeply he'd loved, in his own messy, unmistakable way. For most people, Ozzy Osbourne will always be the Prince of Darkness. The eyeliner, the biting of bats, the slurred speech, the chaos, the spectacle, the punchlines. But to those who knew him, really knew him, he was something else entirely. He was the kid who never believed he was good enough. The man who spent years trying to outrun himself. And, in the end, the husband and father who quietly tried to piece everything back together before the clock ran out. Ozzy never claimed to be a role model. He never apologized in grand public statements. But he did change. And it was that change, quiet, private, deliberate, that spoke louder than any scream on stage ever could. His legacy wasn't just in album sales or record-breaking tours. It wasn't in how many platinum plaques lined the studio walls. It was in the fact that he survived, that he kept going, that he lived long enough to reflect, to grow, to finally tell the truth in the only way he knew how, through the fragments he left behind. Because Ozzy didn't need to write a farewell letter to the world. He didn't need a documentary or a tell-all. He just needed his family to see him, really see him, once the noise had faded. And they did. in the voicemails, in the photos, in the crooked lyrics written in trembling hands, in the song he never titled, in the box no one was meant to open until now. He left them his fortune, yes, but more than that, he left them a map. A final collection of quiet gestures that said, "I was here, I was trying, I loved you." And for the first time, those closest to him aren't remembering the madness. They're remembering the man, the one who lived behind the myth, the one who spent his final days not building an empire, but preserving a heart. And maybe that's what makes this goodbye so hard, because Ozzy Osbourne didn't just disappear. He left slowly, carefully, intentionally, piece by piece. And when his family finally saw everything he'd left behind, they cried not because he was gone, but because, for the first time, they finally understood how much he'd always been there. Ozzy Osbourne didn't leave this world with a bang. He left quietly, carefully, and what he left behind wasn't just a fortune. It was a window into a man who spent a lifetime trying to outrun his past, only to spend his final years making peace with it. To the world, he'll always be the wild one, the bat-biting rocker, the loudest man in the room. But to his family, and now to the fans who are finally seeing the whole picture, Ozzy was something else entirely. A father who tried to make things right, a husband who held on when it got hard, a man who never stopped feeling, even when he couldn't find the words. What he left behind may be worth millions, but its value can't be counted, because tucked into every lyric, every voice memo, every dusty photo, is the truth of a man who spent his life screaming on stage, but saved his quietest, most honest words for the people who mattered most. For more emotional stories, check out this video.